Okay, our next speaker comes from the University degli Studi di Milano. Sorry, I'm not an Italian. Francesco Corti, where is he? Yeah. Ah, there he is already, okay. And I'm sure that your paper will be as stimulating as Chiara's paper was, as you are talking about a mission impossible or a possible mission. The question of socializing the European Union, a mission impossible, question mark, the case of the posting of workers directive. Francesco, you've got the floor.
Thanks a lot for the introduction. Good morning, everyone. And I would like to start by thanking as well the foundation of Yuste for having given us such a great opportunity in such an inspiring atmosphere. And I would like to thank in particular Jürgen Helvert and Juan Carlos Moreno Pinheiro for having organized the seminar, and obviously the Secretario del Seminario, Miguel, muchas gracias. Vielen Dank. And let me thank Don Marcelino Oreja for his inspiring words that led and initiated our discussion this morning. As a political scientist, it's for me an honor to talk in front of a former commissioner, and so I'm really proud of having had this opportunity, so thanks a lot. In yesterday's speech, Don Marcelino Oreja mentioned the social dimension of the European Union as one of the key areas where to focus the European action and where to find the values and the goals of the European Union we are looking for to relaunch the European project. And that's why my presentation will be focused on one of the latest initiatives of the European Commission. The title reads as follows: Tensions over Social Europe, the case of the Posting of Workers Directive. If you may have read maybe from the program, the title that I present today is slightly different from the one that I presented in my submission application for the award. At that time, the title read something like Mission Impossible, Socializing the European Union through the European Pillar of Social Rights. I admit that that title was more catchy. This one is more academic, but as you know, you have to find a case study to discuss about your findings. And the Posting of Workers Directive indeed is one of the most important initiatives that has been launched by the Juncker Commission in the framework of the European Pillar of Social Rights. Therefore, for those of you who doesn't know anything about the European Pillar of Social Rights, I would like to spend a couple of words just to introduce you this really important and flagship initiative for the European Commission. In 2015, the President of the European Commission, in front of the European Parliament during the State of the Union speech, all of a sudden said, well, guys, we need a European Pillar of Social Rights. We need a minimum floor of social rights to be guaranteed to every European citizen. And I really like the formula in which he decided to frame it. He said, we need a social triple A for the European Union that is equally important to the financial and economic triple A. Indeed, he posed the question in terms of rebalancing the asymmetry between the economic and the social dimension of the European Union. But why was that needed? Well, Chiara before mentioned the Great Recession. Indeed, the Great Recession represented the turning point for the European Union. The new economic governance that has been established in the aftermath of the 2008-2009 crisis that turned afterwards in a debt crisis represented a quantum step, let's say, a significant step in the capacity of the European Union in influencing the decision-making processes at national level and influencing the policies that are being adopted at national level. And as you may know, after the introduction of the six-pack, the two-pack, the European semester, and then the fiscal compact, though the fiscal compact is outside the Euro treaties, indeed the European Union acting directly in what I would call the national social sovereignty of European member states. And this was the reason why a lot of member states, especially in Southern Europe, I'm thinking about Spain, Italy, Greece, Cyprus and Portugal, started to perceive the European Union not as the hopeful project that they were looking for at before, but they started to look at the European Union as a threat, as the mask of austerity measures that have been imposed to member states. And the asymmetry between the social dimension and the economic dimension of the European Union has started to broaden a little bit after the crisis. But the complicated relationship between the economic and the social dimension of the European Union doesn't root in the euro crisis. Its roots are far, far more before the establishment of the new economic and monetary union. You can look, I would say, to the creation of the single market. After the creation of the single market, the process of economic integration, as said by Professor Ferreira, started to clash with the national social sovereignty spaces. The famous Gilpin's motto, according to which it was possible to follow Smith abroad and Keynes at home, started not to be as effective as it was before. A clear example at case is the posting of workers issue. You may know that after the southern enlargement, so not after the eastern enlargement, but after the southern enlargement to Spain and to Portugal, there was the famous Rush Portuguesa case of the European Court of Justice. Basically, Portuguese workers sent to France in the freedom to establishment services that was possible, but their salary was lower than the standards in France, and that created unfair competition at the expense of the social rights of the Portuguese workers. So the problem of the asymmetry between the economic and the social dimension of the European Union is long-standing at the heart of the European project. Let's say that the crisis exacerbated this asymmetry, and that's why Juncker, in 2015, decided to launch the European Pillar of Social Rights. What's the European Pillar of Social Rights? It consists basically in a set of social rights that, according to the Commission, should be guaranteed to every European citizen. They are 20 principles that are listed in 3 main headings: equal opportunities and access to labor market, fair working condition, and social protection and inclusions. If I may have to mention a couple of them, the European Pillar of Social Rights states the right of every European citizen to have fair working condition, minimum wage, minimum income, housing, healthcare, pension, access to education, lifelong learning, and so on and so forth. With this initiative, the European Commission wanted to set a floor of minimum social rights and to change the austerity mask that has been, let's say, attributed to the Commission during the crisis. There was a long-standing debate, and in 2017, November 17, the President of the European Commission, the President of the Council of the European Union, and the President of the European Parliament signed an interinstitutional proclamation on the European Pillar of Social Rights. There are a lot of lawyers here, so the question is it legally binding? The answer is not. It's not legally binding. It's a political initiative that indeed is important. But its bindingness is linked to the initiative that has been launched in the aftermath of the proclamation of the European Pillar of Social Rights. This I identify in other research that I've done 3 main functions of the European Pillar of Social Rights. First, regulative. Second, coordinative, and third, redistributive. So we may see the effects of this declaration of social rights in regulative terms, in directives and regulations adopted by the European Union, and in my presentation I will focus on one of them. We may see the effect of the European Pillar of Social Rights in the coordinative arena, namely in the European semester, that is the process, as you know, of surveillance of macroeconomic and fiscal policies within the European Union, but also of coordination of employment and social policies in the European Union. And then we can see the effects of the social pillar in redistributive terms, in terms of budget. So in the initiatives that are adopted in the framework of the multi-annual financial framework, this is the 7 years budget of the European Union. I decided to focus on the Posting of Workers Directive for several reasons, but because it's one of the most and highly debated issue that is at the core of the, let's say, distress, what I call distress of national welfare states, because it has been object of a broad discussion. Let's think about the debate in France on the constitution, on the introduction of the European Constitution. If you remember, at that time, it was even before the Eastern enlargement, there was the famous debate on the Polish plumber. So the threat represented by the Polish people coming to France and stealing their job. Let's think about Brexit. If you remember, Nigel Farage focused his discourse on the necessity to take back money from the EU to finance the national health system. And he stressed the risk represented by European people coming to Great Britain to steal their national welfare system. So I decided to focus on this topic because I do think it's academically very interesting, and lots of research has been already done, but they have mainly focused on legal aspects of the Posting of Workers Directive and economic analysis, cost and benefit analysis of this phenomenon. And it's politically very interesting because it represents a serious vulnus in the debate on the European integration process. This is why I chose this topic. But let's spend a couple of words with you just to understand what does the posting of worker mean. Well, posting of workers, we may define it as the intra-EU mobility of workers legally employed in their country who are for a limited period sent by their employer to another country to work in cross-border provision of services. Before, I mentioned the example of Portuguese workers who have been sent to France to provide their service, and in the framework of the service of the freedom to provide service within the European Union. In quantitative terms, this phenomenon is really narrow. It's only 2 million people. These are data from 2017. 2 million people is really a small number. And it represents more or less 1%, less than 1% of the working population in the EU. But why does it represent such an amazing challenging for the European project? Why does it represent a big problem? Well, let's say it has been increased in the recent year. From 2011 to 2017, posting of workers have been increasing by 58%, and especially so in some sectors, notably construction. And if you think about the crisis and the crisis of the construction sector during the Euro crisis, the fact that a lot of services were provided by other workers from other countries where the construction sector in France, in Italy, in Germany were in crisis in the aftermath of the crisis may explain why this work represented a political problem for the stability of the European project that was perceived as a threat and not as a hope as it was before. In legal terms, as I said, the first problem was the southern enlargement. Therefore, President of the European Commission, Jacques Delors, one of the most enlightened presidents of the European Commission, he perceived, he represented the dream of social Europe in concrete. He said, well, we created a common market, now we have to regulate the market so that it doesn't, we do not have a common market at the expense of labor and employment and social standards. And therefore, in 1991, he proposed the introduction of the Posting of Workers Directive. But as you may imagine, the topic was highly controversial also at that time, because countries like Spain and Portugal didn't want to renounce their competitive advantage represented by their lower labor costs. So it took 5 years to find an agreement in 1996, and maybe Marcelino Oreja remember the discussion in 1994, 1995, at that time was highly crucial. Well, what does this directive said in 1996? It said basically whenever a worker is posted to another country, he should respect a set of minimum rights that are established in the host countries in terms of maximum working period, minimum rest period, minimum rates of pay, conditions of hiring out workers, health and hygiene at work, protection of pregnant women, and equal treatment between men and women. So it was necessary to set a minimum floor of social rights to be guaranteed to workers moving in the EU, so that the the freedom to provide service among countries would have not come at the expense of labor standards in member states with lower salaries and lower wages. However, we are in 2019 now, and in the meanwhile, a lot of things occurred in between the so-called Eastern enlargement, which represented obviously a further problem for the European integration, and especially for the so-called upward convergence of social standards within the EU. And therefore, the 1996 directive started to become, let's say, problematic. Problematic in two ways. The first one, I call it legislative gaps of the Posting of Workers Directive. Legislative gaps in which sense? First, if you look at the definition of posting of workers in 1996 directive, it states basically that a posted worker is a worker that generally carries his job in a member state and who is temporarily sent or posted to another member state. This definition is highly problematic in two senses. First, what does it mean that a worker generally carries his job in one member state? One of the problems that arose soon after the creation of the adoption of the Posting of Workers Directive is the so-called letterbox company problem. Namely, those companies that are ad hoc created in one member state with a simple aim to source workers from that member state, profiting from lower social standards, and immediately posted to another member state. If you do not provide a clear definition in legal terms of what do you mean with a worker carrying a job in one member state, then you have the problem that the new companies that are ad hoc created just for the purpose of profiting from the lower standards. And this creates two problems. The first, in terms of labor standards and social conditions of workers coming from lower wages member states, and then in terms of fair competition between member states. The other problem is linked to the definition of temporary sent to another member state. In this case, what does it mean temporary? How much is it? Usually, if you look at the statistics, you realize that posted workers are sent for 4-5 months maximum. But there is no clear legal rule that establishes what does it mean. And this creates a problem of coordination and harmonization with other EU regulation, and notably I'm thinking about the regulation on the coordination of social security system that regulates the period after which a worker who is working in another member state should respect the fiscal rules first, and then the labor and employment standards of that member state. And this creates, obviously, a problem which all of we know, that is the problem of the so-called social dumping. So the problem that arises whenever an enterprise profiting from lower standards in one member state decides to settle his business in that member state and to perform unfair competition to other member states. There are legislative gaps, but there are also structural gaps. Before I was mentioning the asymmetry between the economic and social dimension of the European Union. If you look at the legal basis of the Posting of Workers Directive, it is based on Article 56 of the Treaty Functioning of the European Union, which deals with the freedom to provide service. But it doesn't mention the freedom of the right of non-discrimination and the right of equal treatment. So the legal basis of the Posting of Workers Directive is the freedom to establish services. This led to several problems when the European Court of Justice had to decide whether, for example, in the famous Laval case, Laval was, if I'm not mistaken, a Latvian company who posted its workers in Sweden. In Sweden, they were obviously obliged by the Posting of Workers Directive in 1996 to respect the minimum set of rights that were established at the national level. However, as you may know, in Sweden there is a strong bargaining system where trade unions play a key role, and they have local collective agreements. So the set of rights that are established in Sweden are defined by collective agreement, so they are not universal at national level, but a set of rights are also established at the local level by the bargaining between trade unions and employers. When the Latvian company refused to accept the social standards established at the local level by trade unions in Sweden, while trade unions in Sweden decided to strike. And this forced the Latvian company to stop their work in Sweden. Therefore, the Swedish company appealed to the European Court of Justice, who indeed ruled that the freedom to provide service had a priority on the specific set of social rights established at the local level by trade unions. And so this Latvian company was allowed to establish its business, to respect the minimum set of rights defined by the directive on posting of workers, but not the other rights that are established at the local level. And this created obviously a clash between economic goals and social goals within the posting of workers directive. And this obviously created a high debate. Let's think about the Front National in France. Let's think about Brexit. I mentioned already Nigel Farage in the UK. I mentioned already all this populistic rhetoric against the European Union, which was de facto and really perceived as a threat to national social standards. Therefore, as I said, legislative gaps and structural gaps created problems in terms of frauds, circumvention of rule of law, social dumping, and asymmetry between economic and social objectives. That's why 2012, the European Commission, Barroso II, decided to propose a reform of the Posting of Workers directive, and in particular to tackle this asymmetry between social and employment, social and economic goals within the Posting of Workers directive, by the introduction of the so-called Monti II regulation. So before we had the directive, now we have a regulation. The objective of this regulation was twofold. The first one was to guarantee that the freedom to establishment does not restrict the fundamental rights to take collective action, so to rebalance economic and social rights. And second, it proposed to create a dispute resolution mechanism, non-judicial instrument for cross-border situation. However, as you may already know, the proposal failed. The proposal failed for different reasons. The first one, it didn't tackle de facto the asymmetry between economic and social rights within the Posting of Workers directive. In fact, if you look at how it is framed, the Monti II regulation, it is based on the ruling of the European Court of Justice, who, as you know, have ruled before that the economic goals prevail on the social objectives. So, and de facto didn't tackle the asymmetry that I was mentioning before in terms of the legal basis of the directive. Moreover, the Monti II regulation has another problem. It's a regulation. Namely, it is directly applicable to national legal system, which represents a serious problem in terms of subsidiarity, because the fact that the European Union was imposing its rules at national level without passing to national legal system. The reaction, you know, there was the activation of the so-called early warning mechanism, so the possibility that have national member states to appeal to the European Commission whenever they judge a proposal for a regulation or a directive as not appropriate. So they unveil a problem of subsidiarity and a lack of European competencies, so they activated the so-called yellow card, and the Barroso Commission decided to withdraw the proposal. This is 2012. Now, I want to draw your attention on the fact that in 2016, Juncker came, proposed a revision of the Posting of Workers Directive as one of the initiatives in the framework of the European Pillar of Social Rights, with the twofold objective. The first one was to tackle the wage differentials and unfair competition between East and West. And the second one was to harmonize the Posting of Workers Directive with other legislative initiatives, namely the coordination of social security system. Among the 5 areas of intervention that have been proposed by President Juncker, we can mention the proposal to introduce the principle of equal pay for equal work in the same workplace. So, namely, the proposal of the Commission is that a posted workers in a member state is entitled to have the same remuneration. The same remuneration means not only same working conditions in terms of time, in terms of health, in terms of hygiene, but means also in terms of holidays, allowances. So there is a real parification between the concrete salary between the posted workers and the local workers. He proposed to review the rules on long-term posting, setting a maximum period of temporary posting workers at 24 months, according to the regulation of coordination of social security system. He proposed a new provision on subcontracting and on agency workers, and I'm not going to go into detail. But now I want to draw your attention on one element. In 2012, Barroso proposed to reform the Posting of Workers Directive. In 2016, but he failed. In 2016, only 4 years afterwards, Juncker was able to make this proposal approved by the European Parliament, the Council, and the European Parliament and the Council. So the question is, what happened in between? And so that's why I decided to focus the second part of my presentation, which is actually the object of the paper, so this was a sort of a long introduction, on what are the conditions that led, let's say, from the failure of the Monti II regulation in 2012 and to the adoption of the Posting of Workers condition. And in particular, the aim of the paper that I sent for this seminar was to investigate the underpinning conflict dynamics that emerged during the debate on the Posting of Workers. As I said before, the Posting of Workers Directive is a highly debated issue. It's politically and academically relevant. However, academically speaking, researchers have mainly focused on the legal aspects that I have been mentioning before, or they have been focusing on the cost and benefit analysis of the economic cost-benefit analysis of the phenomenon of the posting of workers itself. But as a political scientist, I would say that there is a lack of research in the political dynamics underpinning this directive. Let's think about the fact that everyone agreed with the European Pillar of Social Rights on a set of minimum social rights. And everyone agreed on the fact that we should guarantee minimum wage, minimum income, and so on, and fair working condition, decent working condition, and so on and so forth. But why is it so difficult to arrive to a compromise on that? And that's why I decided to focus my paper on the conflict dynamics over the Posting of Workers Directive in order to understand which are the tensions underpinning the debate over this directive, and more in general to draw some conclusions on the tensions that are underpinning the creation of a stronger social dimension of the European Union, which will be object of my conclusions. I will go really fast on the theoretical framework. There is a broad analysis on the conflict dynamics that characterize the debate at the European level. In the specific case of this paper, you may read all the other theories in the paper, but I will focus directly on the theoretical framework that I'm using. It's the one that Professor Ferreira elaborated at the University of Milan. So he said that actually the conflict dynamics characterizing the European debate on social policies is characterized by 4 main lines of conflicts. I drop one of them because 2 of them are so-called functional lines of conflict, which are quite accepted in the literature. So the typical conflict between left and right. I call it, because I think it's better, market making and market correcting. So supporters of regulation of the market and supporter of the deregulation of the market. The second line of conflict is between national social sovereignty and the EU law conditionality. So the clash between those who want to give more competencies to the European Union and those who want to preserve national competencies. In the literature, they usually speak about pro versus further European integration. I think it's better to specify what do we mean when we say pro versus further European integration. In the social policy domain, I do think that it regards the problem between giving more competence to the European Union, deciding, for example, social standards at the EU, at the national level, or keeping these competence at national level. And the third line of conflict is what I call a territorial lines of conflict between high-wage member states or high welfare state member states and low-wage member states, so those member states with lower social standards and lower welfare states. I would like to spend a couple of words more on this dynamic, because when you look at the third line of conflict, you may think East versus West, as if there are like they're completely blocked in the West, supporting social rights because they have higher welfare states, and in the East they are only caring about lowering social standards to be more competitive. No, it's more complicated. For example, Raznaka divides this conflict in two dimensions. She distinguishes between the so-called economic interest of Western member states. The economic interests of Western member states consist in fair competition with Eastern countries. And this economic interest, obviously, of Eastern member states is to access the labor market of the Western member states. But then there is a second dimension, which is the social interest of Western member states, which consists in the autonomy of their social system. As we said before, the example of trade unions in Sweden. Sweden has the social interest in keeping his national welfare state and bargaining system alive. And the social interests of Eastern countries, which no one speaks about when dealing with the posting of workers. So the social rights of workers coming from the East when they work in the West. So, and the theory of Ferreira says, well, these tensions do not work by silos. So you cannot interpret the political conflict over social Europe by using only one of them. But it's a clash syndrome. It's the overlapping of these tensions that may explain the political debate and the difficulty to find a compromise on social and employment issue at the EU level. Against this background, I elaborated my hypothesis, namely I do expect that policymakers with a market-correcting vision of the EU are more inclined to favor a revision of the posting of workers and regulation of the labor market. On the vice versa, those policymakers with market-making idea of the EU might favor not to review the posting of workers directive. Second hypothesis, I do expect that those policymakers who are pro further EU integration in the social policy arena are more in favor for further regulation of the posting of workers directive and vice versa. And I do expect that policymakers coming from Eastern countries with lower wage welfare states may be less inclined to favor a revision of the posting of workers directive. What do I mean with policymakers? Let's go to the methodology. I looked at the debate both within the European Parliament and within the European Council. So basically, policymaker in the European Parliament means member of the European Parliament. I think that the viewpoint of the European Parliament is the best viewpoint for whoever wants to study policy making at the EU level, because in the European Parliament you have both national and functional interests, because you belong both to your national delegation, but at the same time you are part of a political group. So in the European Parliament you can really trace both the interests that may guide the action of an MEP, whether he's driven much more on his being left-wing or right-wing or centrist, or maybe he's more driven by being Spanish or Swedish or German. So I look at the debate in the European Parliament from a quantitative perspective by looking at the roll call vote, so the results of the vote on the posting of workers, and from a qualitative perspective, I look at all the amendments that have been tabled in the debate within the EMPL committee. So I analyzed something like 523 amendments in order to understand what member of the European Parliament's position for and what are the issues on which they struggle in the framework of the Posting of Workers Directive. And then I look more shortly, because of the lack of the detail, not always data from the Council are available, but I look at the vote in the Council, I look at of position papers of member states, and obviously at the record of the EPSCO Council meetings. So let's move from member states. As soon as the revision of the posting of workers was proposed, we had an interesting reaction of member states, because two letters have been sent by member states. On the one hand, there was a Western coalition. On the other hand, there was an Eastern coalition. On the one hand, the Western countries such as Austria, Belgium, France, Germany, Luxembourg, Netherlands, Sweden, they asked the Commission to review the Posting of Workers Directive in the name of fair competition and respect of national social sovereignty in defining labor standards. On the other hand, Eastern member states such as Bulgaria, Czech Republic, Estonia, Hungary, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Romania, and Slovakia, they tabled a letter to the European Commission saying, no, you should not revisit this directive. And here we are the first big tension that we identified before between Eastern member states and Western member states. At the same time, also in this case, there was the activation of the so-called early warning mechanism, so the yellow card procedure. 11 national parliaments decided to submit a reasoned opinion to the European Commission, stressing the fact that the revision of the Posting of Workers Directive was too premature and was in violation of the principle of proportionality. If you look at the member states who tabled this 11 reasoned opinion, they are all coming from Eastern countries, which explains, again, the cleavage, the tension between different set of interests between Eastern and Western member states, which is the divide that, by the way, characterized the most the Posting of Workers Directive. However, if you look at the European Parliament, something more interesting emerged in the analysis. Here I decided to put the graph of the vote in the European Parliament. The red votes are the votes in favor of the revision of the Posting of Workers Directive, and the votes in blue are against, and in gray they are abstentions. What you can observe from this figure is quite clear. Basically, you can observe that the majority of the left-wing parties, which we may associate to the market-correcting view of the European Union, they all vote in favor of the revision of the Posting of Workers. The Social and Democrats vote unanimously in favor, which means something interesting, meaning that also the Eastern member of the European Parliament belonging to the Social and Democrats, they voted for the revision of the Posting of Workers, which goes a little bit against the idea that there are two blocks between the East and the West. Then we turn to the Eurosceptic parties. And this is really interesting, because if you see the ENF, Le Pen, Salvini, and those guys, they decided to abstain. You may expect Eurosceptic party to oppose any proposal of the European Commission, but not in this case, because obviously the interest of this party is to defend national social sovereignty sphere. And this is a topic that is really interesting to be debated. So how populist parties were able to regain the social agenda in their national public debate. I'm thinking about Italy especially. And then there is a very interesting performance in the popular European People's Party and in the Liberals. Because as you can see, they are completely split. Half of the members of the European Parliament voted in favor, and half voted against. So I decided to focus on, I decided to focus on who are the members of the Liberals and the People's Party who voted against. And as you can observe, Hungary, Poland, Czech Republic, Slovakia, Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia, and so on and so forth. So the first thing that you can notice is that the People's Party and the Liberal parties split exactly on the East-West divide, meaning that the Social and Democrats, the GUE and the Greens, they were united. So the East-West divide doesn't explain their behavior. But the East-West divide may explain the behavior of the Christian Democrats and the Liberals. So the famous overlapping tensions that I was mentioning before emerges quite clearly from this graph. Then we should discuss about Germany and Sweden, who decided, by the way, to vote against the people's. But then, if there are any questions, I will explain why. Which are the areas on which are the tensions that the areas on which the majority of the tensions emerged in the debate within the European Parliament? Well, the legal basis, obviously. Should we have as a legal basis of the posting of workers the freedom to establish services, or also the freedom of movement of workers, equal non-discrimination and equal opportunity? The other issue is labor costs should be a competitive factor in the internal market or should not be a competitive factor in the internal market? Who is entitled to establish the rules on remuneration, national member states or at the EU level? And these areas are characterized by a conflict between market making and market correcting. Then we have a conflict on the determination of the habitual place of work, the famous problem that I mentioned at the beginning, so where the work is generally carried, the cumulative working period, so how long does the posting of workers last, and extension to other sectors such as the road transport sector. In this case, obviously, the conflict is between Eastern member states and Western member states because of the reason that I mentioned at the beginning of my presentation. And then obviously there is again a conflict between national social sovereignty and EU law conditionality on who is entitled to define the elements of the remuneration, member states or European level. If you look at the vote of the Council, basically it confirms this clash, because if you look at the member states who voted indeed against, Hungary, Poland, Latvia, Lithuania, Croatia abstained, and UK is a different case because, you know, after Brexit they decide to abstain on the majority of the votes in the Council. Conclusions. So, according to my hypothesis, there were three main lines of conflict that may characterize the debate on the posting of workers, and especially these lines of conflicts overlap each other. I do think that the paper gives enough findings and proof of the existence of these conflict dynamics, which I do consider really interesting because it goes a little bit beyond what the usual interpretation of the conflict on posting of workers. It's not just East versus West, but it's also market making versus market correcting and EU law conditionality versus national social sovereignty. What do we learn for the future of social Europe? So I go back again to the question, mission impossible, socialize the European Union. Well, with what I wanted to do in this paper, which is obviously part of a broader project in which I analyze each of the lines of conflict in different initiatives, was to provide you a dimension of the how complex is the negotiating on social and employment issue at the European level. I do think that indeed, as Marcelino Reia said yesterday, we cannot escape from strengthening the social dimension of the European Union. There is no future without a stronger social dimension of the EU, which doesn't mean that we have to have a supranational welfare state. No, Maurizio Ferreira and others argue about the necessity of a European social union, namely a European Union that provides all the instruments to maintain national social welfare states and that intervenes with supranational measures in terms of legislation, in terms of macroeconomic stabilization mechanism, that intervenes only whenever the negative externalities coming from the European integration process may hamper the national welfare system. So the idea of a European social union is that the European Union provides just the base to guarantee flourishing national welfare states and intervenes only whenever the process of European economic integration hamper or have negative externalities on national social and employment standards. Whether the European Pillar of Social Rights has achieved this, I'm not sure. I do think that it was a first very important step. If you think at the European Pillar of Social Rights, it reminded me the Delors Charter of the workers, social workers, the social rights of workers, establishing a set of minimum rights. This is that are to be guaranteed at the European level. This is, I think, the path is really difficult because you see all the tensions that are overlapping, and it's difficult to find a compromise, but it is the only way to contrast the populist and the Eurosceptic movement and to relaunch the social values that belongs to the European project. Thank you.
Thank you, Francesco.
35.
35, an absolutely brilliant landing, so to speak. That's what's happening when you create a common domestic market, isn't it? Yeah. I could even top it a bit. What to do with a Polish lorry driver who's regularly driving to France via Germany? Which laws apply? Is it the Polish law? Is it the Polish, French, or German law, or is it a kind of European solution which has to be found? Okay, dear friends and colleagues, now the questions.
Well, for the great presentation. I have a question. First of all, to introduce myself, I'm Nicoletta Thoma. I'm from the University of Leicester in the UK. I have a question from methodologically speaking. You said that you're going to analyze quantitatively and qualitatively. Qualitatively speaking, you're going to analyze, you're going to do a content analysis. Have you thought to do a discourse analysis at the same time, like apart from analyzing what is said, to find the reasons behind what the voters have said? And my second question is about if you have adopted a feminist perspective, like the difference between genders, what say women voters and men voters have said, or why they have said, would you find different results? Thank you.
Yes.
Francesco, thank you so much. I just would like to ask you a few comments on minimum wage proposals at the European level, and also what to do according to you that are studying this debate regarding countries that will face the challenge of democratic winter, so the aging of our societies. That's not just an Italian problem or Spanish, but also Germany probably will be the most affected in the future. So I think that we cannot decontextualize these problems from the challenges I just mentioned. Thank you.
Do you want to comment it?
So, yeah, thanks a lot, both Nicoletta and Matteo. There are two different questions. One regards the, it's more academic on the paper. And, I did not consider a possibility to do a discourse analysis just for the fact that analyzing the amendments is quite challenging per se, which requires a specific methodology. Analyzing the amendments means that you have a small piece of the Commission proposal that members of the European Parliament are able to amend. So you have a small amount of text, which is regarding a specific issue areas. For example, the definition of the elements of remuneration, duration of the posting of workers, and so on and so forth. And for each issue, every member of the European Parliament can table an amendment. And what I did basically was to pick up the most contentious issues, which are obviously those one related to the most highly debated topic in the Posting of Workers Directive, and I looked qualitatively at how members of the European Parliament amended it. So basically, if you take the paper, you see a nice, I hope, table in which I listed the issue areas with the proposal of the Commission, and then whether the member of European Parliament amended it in a positive way, or they deleted it, or they watered it. And that was enough to understand whether they were in favor or they were against a specific proposal. As regards the feminist perspective, I would like to discuss with you on that, because I'm not at all an expert. I do think that, by the way, on this topic, it didn't and doesn't play at all a role. So if I may had to distinguish between women and the men voting in the European Parliament, I would have just exactly the same graph that I showed you, in which they divide according to the same divides. Also because, as regards the Posting of Workers Directive, obviously it's not a gender issue that may to be taken into consideration. I answer as well to what you say about the road transport sector. As I said, obviously the revision of the Posting of Workers Directive is the result of a compromise. And if you may have noted the vote of the Council, some Eastern member states decided indeed to vote in favor. I'm thinking about Czech Republic, Bulgaria, Romania, and Slovakia. Why did they vote in favor? They voted in favor because they obtained that the removal of the proposal to extend the Posting of Workers Directive rules to the road transport sector, which indeed is a highly problematic sector, because who decides how long is the truck driver resting after having driven from Romania to Germany? Who decides how long can a Bulgarian driver stay in France? How many delivery can he do in France, 1, 2, 3, before coming back to his own country? Obviously, there was the necessity to find a compromise, and not to water down completely the Posting of Workers Directive. They decided to drop one of the most important indeed sector, also considering the fact that the construction sector, which is the other sector in which posting is really important, had been partially reformed already a couple of years ago. I don't remember exactly when. So this is the result of a compromise, which I mentioned obviously in the paper, but indeed it explains the complexity of achieving a compromise on social employment policy at the EU level. So it's really easy to talk about social Europe, but it risks to be sometimes a wishful thinking if you do not consider the conflict dynamics behind and how difficult it is to find an agreement. And therefore I go to Matteo, who mentioned a couple of topics that are not part of the posting, but are part of the European Pillar of Social Rights. The first question regarding the minimum wage. When, and I was at the time in the European Parliament, it was discussed the formula of the European Pillar of Social Rights, and the rapporteur Maria João Rodrigues proposed the introduction of a minimum wage at the European level in the form of a directive. The idea was to set a 60% minimum wage compared to the regional average wage, because obviously you cannot set a minimum wage at the EU level where you have such an asymmetry between wages across the EU. Not only East versus West, but also West versus West. Let's think about salaries in Portugal and all the debate that they recently had on minimum income in Portugal, and also actually in Spain, if I'm not mistaken. So I do think that it is possible, by the way, to achieve a compromise, and we have a great news. I don't know if you know, but Angela Merkel, so not the most radical leftist policy maker, she said that she's in favor of establishing a directive on a minimum wage at the EU level. I do think that is a feasible proposal if elaborated and framed in a nice way. So referring to the regional average wage, because let's consider our country, Italy. well, beside the fact that we do not have a minimum wage in Italy, but let's consider the fact if we add a minimum wage, obviously we cannot set the same minimum wage in Milano as in Palermo, let's say. So it's important that to take into consideration the regional level. So, and I do think that on minimum wage, the European Union has a margin for maneuver to act concretely and to provide a solution. As regard aging, well, and democratic winter, that's what you said, yeah? I'm less prepared on that. I really do not know. Well, obviously, if you look at the agenda of the EU, and if you read the principle of the European Pillar of Social Rights, it speaks about lifelong learning. And if you look at the social investment package 2013, it was the idea of enabling also older workers and to provide them skills to stay in the labor market. It's at the core of the, let's say, 2020 agenda of the EU. But in terms of concrete measures to be adopted beyond benchmarking, I do not know, maybe I'm mistaken, any concrete policy proposal to be put forward to implement it.
Polly.
Over here. Thank you. Hi, I'm Polly from the University of Salamanca. I have a legal background, so I found your presentation extremely interesting from a political view, although it was a lot of information, so I'm going to see if I'm going to get this right. But I found especially interesting how MEPs vote in the European Parliament, because there seems to be two tendencies, and if I understood it correctly, the left, in this case, seem to have voted with workers' rights in mind in general, so that would be with all EU citizens in mind, whereas the other parties seem to have voted more with national interests in mind, and that would mean national citizens. So I thought it was very interesting. This seems to be a result of parliament elections, of course, still being nationally based. So supposedly these MEPs are representing our EU citizens' rights, but as a matter of fact, it seems that they still have national interests very much in mind because of their connection with who they're representing when they get there, which is the people that voted them, that are, of course, their own citizens. So I think that's something also quite nationalist in the European Union. In fact, in the European Parliament, which was meant to be, at least in my mind up till now, the place where all of our interests were represented. Thank you.
No, go ahead.
Well, thanks a lot. I would like to disclaim, no, I don't want the conclusion is that left-wing MEPs vote for the rights of the citizens and right-wing one no. No, because if you look at the voting behavior of the Front National and Salvini's League, well, they decided for political reason to abstain because they cannot vote with the mainstream party, but they were decisive in letting the revision of the Posting of Workers Directive to be approved, because thanks to their abstention. So if I had to follow your reasoning, I would say that they vote for the citizens. So no, I do think that there is a tendency, obviously, and it depends on the issue area that a specific piece of legislation deal with. Clearly, if you look at employment and social policies, it's easier for the left to be united because the values of the left are much more inclined to market correcting. When I say left, but I want to be clear, obviously I think about the Greens, I think about the extreme left, I think about the Social and Democrats. But don't forget the fact that Jean-Claude Juncker is a Christian Democrat, and he is the one who proposed. So when you say right, I would always distinguish between Christian Democrats and right, because they are two different people. And I experienced it a lot, because the values of Christian Democrats are not the same of the right-wing parties. You cannot compare Orban with Angela Merkel. You cannot compare peace in Poland, let's say, so law and justice in Poland with, I don't know, Partito Popolare in Spain. So we have to, when we say left and right, and that's why I don't like it. I prefer market making and market correcting, because it's I would not say it's too straightforward to say, okay, it's left and it's right. No, it depends on the values you rely on. And when I said I prefer to use market making, market correcting, because if you think about Christian Democrats, I think they are much more market correcting than other right-wing parties. So that's just something that I would like to stress, because it's really important. And what I would like to stress is that the golden age of Don Marcelino Oreja when he was commissioner, so the golden age for social Europe, thanks to Jacques Delors, you might say, yes, he was a left-wing commissioner and he proposed. Well, no, because if you look at the composition of the College of Commissioners, they were half from Christian Democrats, half social and Democrats, and all of them pushed for a social dimension of the EU. If you look at the proposal of Juncker, he's Christian Democrat, but he was the one who pushed for a stronger social dimension of the EU. So obviously, I would say left-wing parties are much more inclined to vote for market-correcting measure. Otherwise, they do not distinguish themselves from right-wing parties. But at the same time, I would not use this category, left and right.
Shouldn't we extend the perspective a bit? If we talk about a social agenda for Europe, shouldn't we also talk about, let's say, tax harmonization? Tax harmonization, yeah. Tax, yeah. Not text, tax. Yeah. Wouldn't it go alongside with establishing this workers' directive? Wouldn't it be consequent? No, it's you. Yeah?
I 100% agree with you, because we do a lot of time discuss about social dumping, which I mentioned, so unfair competition based on different labor standards, and in particular wages. But too many times we forget about fiscal dumping, which is indeed a concrete problem when you have a different level of taxation across the EU. In this case, just think the problem doesn't regard only Eastern countries. Well, obviously, a lower taxation in Slovakia led a couple of Italian enterprises to go to Slovakia, and then there was Commissioner Vestager who said, well, this is unfair competition because they, by purpose, lower their taxes for foreign companies. But think about the Netherlands, think about Luxembourg. So I fully agree that we do have to start talking about taxation. During this commissioner mandate, there was a debate on a corporate-based tax, so a minimum tax for all the enterprises in order to prevent fiscal dumping. It was watered down because national interests still prevail. The debate in the Econ Committee has been obviously highly controversial, but still a compromise solution have been found. But indeed, when you go to the Council, where and on taxation there is the unanimity rule, and you just need one member state who does not want. I just provide you an example. It was on the VAT taxation for books, which is a file I've been working on. The European Parliament found a compromise to tax at the same level e-books and the normal books. and in order, they have a specific taxation to facilitate, obviously, the diffusion of. Well, it was enough that, if I'm not mistaken, Slovakia or Slovenia decided to block the revision of the VAT on books to drop the proposal. So let's imagine about establishing a common corporate tax at the EU level. Indeed, I think it's fundamental to tackle the issue of taxation, harmonization of taxation, and taxation at the EU level. That is another topic, because if you look at the budget of the EU, it is mainly composed by national revenues. If I'm not mistaken, 76% of the EU budget is composed by national member states' revenues, meaning that the national member states still have the power on deciding on how much to spend on the budget first. So if you want to, you say, oh, we have a pillar of social rights, let's increase the European Social Fund, let's create a skills guarantee, let's increase the cohesion spending. But then the budget is basically composed by national revenues, and member states decided not to put €1 more on the budget. I would really like to have some sort of European tax, for example, on a financial transaction tax, which is a sort of tax that cannot be imposed at national level because it doesn't make any sense. But only at the EU level you can tax financial transactions. So why not?
I think it would be a logical consequence out of the whole system of the common market, for freedoms, require certain regulations, that's it, and harmonizations. Yes, go ahead, folks. Further questions, or are you already tired? No.
Well, I have just like a reflection. I don't know if you know, but in Utrecht, in Rentforce, they're analyzing the implementation of these measures, and they're focusing on the social impact of all these measures. I don't know if you're focusing on this, because many times, and of course I'm speaking from a legal perspective, the problem that we have is that we adopt measures, we adopt legal measures, and the problem that we face at the European Union level is that those measures are not effectively and uniformly implemented. So my question to you will be whether you have analyzed this or not, or whether you are interested in this or not, and if you were interested to just have a look at what the Rentforce is doing, because they're focusing on different policy areas of the European Union, and of course the one that you addressed today is one. So whether you have a reflection on this and whether you think that the implementation in the area that you're analyzing is effective and uniform. Thank you.
Anything to add?
Yeah. Thanks. Well, implementation. Whenever a directive or is implemented, is adopted at the EU level, then the last paragraph is dedicated to the implementation terms. Usually, it's 2, 3, 4 years. I don't remember in this case how long it is. So obviously, having been adopted, the revision of the Posting of Workers Directive in 2018 is still not possible to analyze the implementation of the directive at the EU level. But what I can say is that during the political debate, but I would really be interested in getting in contact with these Utrecht groups. Maybe we talk later. When the Commission proposed the review, of the Posting of Workers Directive in 2016, lots of member states said, well, the Commission cannot propose a revision of the Posting of Workers Directive because we still have to implement the Enforcement Directive 2014. I didn't mention the Enforcement Directive because it's not that much important. But after the failure of the Monti II regulation, basically, they were able to agree on the so-called Enforcement Directive of the Posting of Workers Directive, which was basically a directive addressed to tackle letterbox companies. So it didn't tackle the key asymmetry between social and economic rights, but they said, okay, let's set some rules in order to prevent at least frauds and circumvention of rules. And being adopted in 2014, the enforcement directive would have been coming to force by June 2016. The proposal of the Commission was in March 2016. If you read all the reasoned opinion tabled by national parliaments on the revision of the Posting of Workers Directive, they said, well, the Commission is not allowed to propose a revision of the Posting of Workers Directive because of the necessity to implement it. So I'm not, I've obviously, as a political scientist, I can give you the political, the way they use this topic of implementation as a political tool to delay the adoption of a directive such as the revision of the posting of workers. But as regards but I cannot say anything more. In technical terms, by the way, for the posting of workers, we have to wait at least 2020 for see any result. Then there is, you know, all the problem actually about, let's say, checking whether, and you know that one of the proposals that were attached to the European Pillar of Social Rights was the institution of a European Labour Authority, so a new agency with a specific goal, with a low budget, with a specific goal to create European inspectors for checking cross-national provision of services, so namely posting of workers. The budget is only 50 million, but as you say, when something is there in the budget, you cannot delete it. You can just either increase it or keep it.
Don Marcelino.
Yes. I will not raise a question, but rather make a comment. I must say I am really fascinated by the way this meeting is taking place. The speakers and the questions that have been raised are of great importance, and I would like to ask. I don't know how far will be the result of all this. Is it just staying here, or will it be translated perhaps? But will it be possible to have a book that have great success, I'm sure, that takes precisely the different interventions and also the questions? Because the interventions are very brilliant, but also the questions that have been raised and the answers to these questions. I think it's a pity that we would leave only to the spirit of Charles V, certainly here around this place, but I think many people would be very enriched reading what you have been saying. Just leave it there, I just leave it there, and I don't know if, not now perhaps, but later, we could present this if you agree.
Thank you. As far as I know, a publication will be made containing all the papers delivered here. I'm not that sure whether the discussion, which is recorded, will be published as well. This is, I guess, a question of staff also. Is the workforce available simply to write the discussion down? That's a simple technical question. I fully agree. It would be nice to have it written, but on the other hand, it's, as far as I know, also on YouTube. It is recorded. The contributions and the discussions are at least online. So maybe that's a kind of compromise. It's available, it's there, it's out there. It can be watched by whoever wants to watch it. Yeah. Although I agree, the impact factor would be higher if it would be published. Yeah. That's it. Okay, dear friends and colleagues, I see a certain tiredness in this room. Maybe you're all a bit, well, yes, overwhelmed by the information and the discussion. That's why I think I close this morning session and, well, wish us all a good lunch and a safe return this afternoon. Okay, thank you again, Francesco.